The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
You've always got time for short time.
Hey, it's Mario Lopez.
David Taylor.
Brent Metcalf. Johnny Hendricks. Tony Ramos. Bubba J.
Mike Golick.
Matthew Modine. The one and only Chael Sonnen. And you are listening to the one and only Short Time Wrestling Podcast by the often imitated and never duplicated Jason Bryant.
Now up on the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, we have a lot of guests on this show that enjoy fishing, but I believe we have few that enjoy fishing as much as our guest today, Brandon Palaniuk, the Angler of the Year in the Bassmaster Elite Series, I guess. Brandon, first of all, welcome to the program, and did I get that title right?
You did. You nailed it. I'm impressed.
All right. Yeah, well, what the listeners don't know is we talked about this before we started. Anyway, the reason Brandon's on the show is, one, to talk about his Angler of the Year. The AOY, I keep seeing athlete. We'll talk about the athlete versus sport aspect of fishing later, but Angler of the Year, this took place about 100 miles north of where I sit on Lake Mille Lacs in Minnesota, up near Garrison, Aiken area, where my in-laws actually happen to live. And as I come across this story, I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. And then I find out you wrestled, and you were a wrestler growing up, and you wrestled in college. So before we get into your accolades in casting a rod and reel and a lure, which is a lot more involved than that, but how old were you when you first started wrestling?
I started about the same time I started fishing, ironically. I was about 8 years old, and my whole entire family grew up wrestling. My grandfather and all of his brothers, they all grew up wrestling in Nebraska, and it was, my uncles and everybody wrestled in my family, and I didn't start out doing it right away. And I remember I went to one college match at North Idaho College, and I saw the single mat with the single light and thought it was the coolest thing in the world, and decided I wanted to wrestle.
So it was a dual meet that got you into the sport of wrestling, even though you had family that was involved.
Yeah, it was. And they had always, kind of asked, and we were kind of pushing towards it. And then I finally went to one dual meet and saw that and saw the setup and just thought it was such a cool sight to see those guys, kind of just under that one spotlight.
We'll talk about the contrast of that spotlight of a wrestling mat compared to being out on the open water. When it comes to growing up just outside of Coeur d'Alene, which is ironically where North Idaho College went, why did you decide to wrestle in college? I mean, what was we'll talk about how you grew up fishing, but there's an opportunity to wrestle in college. You've got the junior college thing going on, and what made you say, all right, I'm going to stick around here and wrestle in college?
I had kind of, as I was transitioning out of high school and into college, I knew that I wanted to fish for a living, and I had been getting some offers to go and wrestle at some different colleges, and just getting the standard letters and everything. And at that time, I'd kind of already made up my mind that I wasn't going to wrestle in college because I wanted to focus on fishing. But I was still going to go to college, so I went to North Idaho College, and I had known Pat Whitcomb, who was the coach at North Idaho College, and he kept asking me. He said, "Man, I need a 33-pounder, and I need you to come wrestle. I need a 33-pounder." And just there was part of me that still, I guess, wanted that work ethic, that hard work, pushing yourself to the limit. Part of me missed that, and so I agreed to, go and do it. And I wrestled one semester. They had a 33-pounder that wasn't able to do it. I came in, cut the weight, filled the spot, and and I have no regrets. I'm so glad and thankful that I did it.
We're looking at, okay, well, you wrestled in one semester in college, but what about the sport of wrestling outside the mat? Like, once you got into that room, what did you like about the sport?
Are you talking the first time I ever stepped in a mat?
Just
or
what
more
drew,
college?
Beyond what drew you in was the mat light and the environment. But once you do something, you realize that this is pretty hard. What kept you wrestling throughout your high school years?
I think for me, well, one, as a competitor, I just like winning. Like, I loved to just go out there and try to dominate on the mat. But I think there's a certain element to it when you get to a certain level in wrestling where it becomes your life and you dedicate so much time to it, it almost becomes an addiction. That part where you're pushing yourself so hard that you feel like you're going to pass out, or you do pass out, or you throw up, or, there's a sick addiction, I think, to having that, pushing your body to that limit and then getting past it. It was kind of what kept me going. And it's something that even to this day, I think I still miss part of that. There's no other way to get that.
When we look at the idea of fishing for a living, this is something that's foreign to some people. Maybe in your case, I listened to one of your interviews that you're from Idaho, where it's trout fishing up there, streams and rivers versus bass fishing. How do you decide to say, I want to be a fisherman, but I want to be a bass fisherman? I want to be on the Bassmaster series.
The biggest thing for me was just opportunity. There wasn't as much bass fishing opportunity here, but on a international grand scheme of things, bass fishing rules the world in comparison to everything else for, I guess, actually being able to make a living doing it. The whole Bassmaster Elite Series, the tournament trails, the classic, all of that is the pinnacle of the sport. And so for me, that was the direction I was going. That was where I could make a good living. And I think a lot of it comes from like the technique and, just the style of chasing bass versus other species. It's a lot more interactive, requires a lot, I wouldn't say a lot more skill, but a lot more different techniques to be able to do it all around the country.
Yeah, I guess that's probably my question. Even I grew up in, near the Chesapeake Bay, so I always grew up saltwater fishing. We did have a couple rivers that were, bass heavy, more brackish water than anything else. And when I moved out here to Minnesota, I'm still trying to catch my first walleye, and I'm not doing very good at that. I've caught bass up here at some of the lakes, but when you look at the fish itself, what is unique about the bass that makes that the sport fish of choice in this country or around the world, as you said, compared to, say, a walleye or a trout, or even some of the saltwater tours that are out there?
I think the number one factor on that is just the availability and the access to catching bass. It's the most widespread fish there is around the country. It's in almost every single state in the U.S. Whereas like a walleye, your saltwater stuff, your trout, those become more regional because they need certain types of water, or water temperatures and things like that. So I think the biggest appeal to it is just because it's so widespread. It allows more people to have access, and then there's so many different ways to catch them. It's a very interactive way of fishing. You're not just going out there casting a bobber out there and sitting, or you're not going out and just sticking a rod in a rod holder and trolling around the lake. Those are great ways to catch fish. But for a guy like me that likes to be really interactive and on the offense, I like bass fishing for that reason.
Yeah, because I would joke that, we're fishing for flounder. What that means is you get a flounder rig on the bottom. You rig it up. You put 4 poles in the rod holders. You crack a beer and you wait.
Exactly.
And some people look at that as like, that's not a sport. That side of it, maybe not. But
not as much.
What is the sporting aspect? You said earlier that you love to win, and bass fishing and Bassmaster Series, there are competitions. You win, you're at the top, you're holding up the fish, the crowd's going nuts. I've actually, in the backstory, I actually did go to one of the Bassmaster Championships, I think when I was like 9 or 10 years old with my dad, when it was in Richmond, Virginia, and these guys are bringing their boats in and they're holding up fish and people are cheering. I'm like, the heck, I have no idea what was going on.
Yep.
And so explain what the competitive aspect is like in these competitions, and and why this type of opportunity, this type of activity, this type of sport makes you, drives you to win because, like you said, you like winning.
Yeah, I just like beating other guys or girls if there's, girls fishing too. But I mean, I like to win. And from the fishing aspect of it, you're figuring out another living creature that doesn't live by the same rules as us. They have their own set of rules, the way that they live, and their lives are extremely simple. All they need is cover and food, essentially. But it is so complex and different from the way that we live that it's a challenge. It's changing. Their lives are all dependent upon what Mother Nature throws at us and everything. So for me, it's constantly changing, always keeps my mind on edge. And we go to places that sometimes you're out there in 6, 7, 8 foot waves, and it requires, balance. I mean, we're fishing in 20 to 21 foot boats. So it's not like we're out there in these giant ocean yachts. You're in a 20-foot boat and 8-foot rollers. It takes a little bit of balance and athleticism to stay standing. We're not sitting down. We're standing. We're casting. We're moving around. And, it's the most interactive way that you can fish to me.
From your vantage point, or from what you understand about how the series works, how does Bassmasters select the sites for the tour and for example, the Angler of the Year Championship, which just finished up at Lake Mille Lacs up in northern Minnesota?
So a big part of their selection process is the towns actually coming and bidding for us to come, because we have such an economic impact on the area when we come to a place. So a lot of the city of commerce will come and go to BASS and say, hey, we want you guys to come. We have this fishery, we have the venue, and they work out a deal to go. As anglers, we hope that we're going to a fishery that's really good, because we want, just like everybody, we want to go catch a bunch of fish. And so that's kind of how they select the different areas, and certain tournaments require certain, venues and things like that. Like the Classic needs to have a giant arena, because it's typically we weigh inside a giant arena for that event.
And now, just as history, as I look back, I think it was 1990 is when I went to that. So that would have probably been the Classic then. It wouldn't have been the Angler of the Year event that my dad took me to, because that was inside the Richmond Coliseum. They were fishing on the James River in Virginia. So that's probably the event. I remember I had a hat. It was back when trucker hats weren't called trucker hats. They were just called hats. And, the mesh back. And I remember that. And it had been in Virginia 2 straight years. And that's really the last time I really came across it, because, as I said, I grew up saltwater fishing. Now, for somebody who's listening to this and they're trying to figure out, how does one decide they want to fish for a living? How did you discover this as an opportunity? Was it something that your family or your grandparents or your dad or a family member said, hey, there is pro fishing?
Being an Idaho guy, I always grew up outside doing things outdoors and had a love for fishing, but I didn't know anything about tournament fishing until I was 8 years old. Had one of my mom's best friends ended up getting married to a guy that fished local tournaments, and he took me out one day, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. Just like the first time I saw, a dual meet in a wrestling match. Like, you get on a boat, 19, 20-foot boat, hops on plane, and next thing you know, you're running 70 miles an hour down the river or down the lake, and just watching like the techniques and how much skill it took to be able to place a lure exactly where he wanted, and that you could actually target a specific species, blew my mind at the time. And I was so intrigued by it, and the more I learned about it, and the more I learned that there were guys making a living doing this and good opportunity at it, kind of is when I decided that's what I wanted to do for a living.
When you talked about winning this and becoming Angler of the Year, you talked about digging in in the start of your career, spending your own money. You didn't have a whole lot of sponsorships. How does a sponsorship work? When did you start picking up some sponsors to cover your gear, to cover your cost of travel? I mean, how does that work from going from, okay, I want to be a bass fisherman to, okay, I'm a sponsored professional bass fisherman?
It really comes with success is really where it comes from. You know, they need, or from a sponsor standpoint, they need somebody that can essentially sell product for them or relate to their customers. And so you have to be successful to have your name out there and kind of build your own brand. And, that's why you look at guys like Dan Gable and John Smith, and like these guys that coming up wrestling have these really well-known names that are able to make, other products from it with their name. And that's essentially what you're doing in fishing is you're building a brand that's well-known, and then the sponsors come along and you work with them to develop products, and, they use your likeness to also promote their products. So first and foremost, it comes from success. And then you have to be able to speak in front of people, work with people, and to continue those relationships to grow.
Two people you mentioned, of course, John Smith and Dan Gable, both guys who love to fish, by the way. Gable's talked about his lake house, which is actually not that far from Mille Lacs, where you were just at, up on Leech Lake. He likes catching walleye up there. And John Smith, his buddy Ed Gallegos, has a big pond. I guess it's bigger than a pond. It's a giant lake on his property. And I think last summer we were down there for Hall of Fame weekend, and he shows me the big bass that he pulled out of the lake. And I'm like, there's two guys that know a little something about fishing. So they've been on the show. They talk fishing all the time. But when we look at, we're coming from a wrestling perspective, wondering about sponsorships, and, there's been pro leagues that have been talked about, and there's been pro leagues that have come up and failed. When it comes to the fan base, how does a fishing fan base exist? Because it's not like there's piles of boats following you around as you're fishing, cheering you on as you do it.
No, it all really, and that is our biggest downfall, and probably why it is not a bigger mainstream sport than what it is because we're not concealed in an arena where fans can come and sit there and watch us actually compete. Now, Bass has done a great job. Now we have actually Bassmaster Live. So people can get online, go to bassmaster.com, they click on live, and it's not all 110 guys competing, but it will show the select guys that have the cameras for that day. And you're able to actually watch the guy fish all day long. Sounds really boring, but from somebody that is like a diehard fan, or even just getting into it to watch it, it almost becomes addicting to see like what these guys are doing. And there's never been access like that before. There's always just been, the media outlets, some videos afterwards, articles, things like that, where now you can actually see it happening as it happens. And I think that's just kind of our first stepping stone into making it bigger. But I think it's just because it's such a wide spread species, it allows people to, kind of relate to it a little bit better, I guess.
Do you find you do your best fishing with or without a cameraman on the boat with you?
I would say probably actually better, because I feel like I need to perform even that much more. Like I want to show people that there's actually fish to be caught.
Now, those conversations, are you essentially talking to the camera? Because I grew up watching, Jimmy Houston or Orlando Wilson, and the 30-minute fishing show. You see, they're talking to the camera guy the whole time, or Jerry Reed, who's down there fishing with him, and it's two guys talking on a boat. What is the relationship like with the camera guy? The camera guys typically, are they fishing people? Do they understand what's going on, or is it just like, okay, here's a camera, I'm going to talk to you a little bit and maybe name drop my sponsor some?
Yeah, they know what's going on, and when we're talking to the cameras, we're talking to the fans pretty much, and a lot of the conversation is just guys thinking out loud it's funny. There's a lot of guys like you put a camera in their boat, and even though they're not talking directly and conversing with the camera, just the thoughts in their head just start coming out of their mouth, and it just, who knows where it's going to go. But the guys are processing the information of what the fish are doing, how they're moving, how they're relating, what's going on, and that comes out. And I think that's what people like to see, is that kind of process of information and how guys adapt to certain situations.
Now comes the I guess the argument you guys probably get from the outside community is we're seeing a lot of colleges add bass fishing for under their sports offerings. We're seeing a lot of them in the South, especially like in the Tennessee, Kentucky area, where it's become a sport that they're putting under the club sports offering. The discussion on is fishing a sport? Take the pro and con of this type of discussion.
There's lots of aspects and there's lots of arguments to it. The biggest thing that I can see is how you go about deciding what exactly the word sport means. Does it come mostly from a mental aspect, or is it just 100% physical? Bass fishing, not the most physical sport there is out there, right? I mean, that's why it has a stereotype of like old Southern fat guys. I know that's the stereotype.
You're hitting close to the vest here.
I'm just trying to change that stereotype, right? Like that's not as much the case now. This guy's coming from all over. But so from a physical standpoint, yes, it's still physical. You're standing on a boat all day, sometimes during practice, 15, 16 hours a day. And, you're up, down, moving around, picking up the trolling motor. So there are physical aspects to it. You're not competing against the other guys physically, like one-on-one or anything.
And the fish aren't throwing hot dogs back at you, seeing if you bite them either.
Yeah, they're not like picking up rocks and throwing rocks at us.
That would be interesting if we ever get to that point where fish evolve to start throwing stuff at you. But anyway.
We probably have bigger problems.
You might have better ratings too.
Guaranteed. No doubt. That's why people watch NASCAR. They want to watch people crash. I mean, but from a mental aspect, it is extremely mental. I think that's probably the biggest thing I've taken from wrestling over to the fishing side is the mentality, kind of that winning mentality, the ability to push yourself and to stay focused and really have a positive outlook, because things can go wrong. And, our tournaments, we've got $100,000 on the line for first place. So that can put a lot of pressure on you when you get in a position to win, and that decision-making process, staying calm, and really looking at the body of water and processing that information and using it to your advantage becomes mental. So there's arguments on both sides of the sport thing. The hardcore guys that do it all the time, it's easy for us to understand why it's a sport, because we've been out there, back-to-back weeks, wears you out. Usually the people that say, no way is it a sport, just haven't spent time with us out there. They haven't seen it. They're not fully understanding of what we do. And then there's the argument of not being a sport. So, I get both sides of it. Yeah, it's not as physical, equally as mental as anything else.
Well, you've got prize money. That's definitely professional right there. And then you've got an opponent, which is an animal that that you've got to outsmart. You have a home field advantage because everything is on their home field. There's also video games, so there's plenty of sport video games. Therefore, one of my buddies used to write a column back in the day, kind of looking at like I'm taking this kind of a snarky approach to what is the sport. It says, well, fishing, they've got video games, sport. So, playing black bass on Nintendo back in the day. So you've got my vote. But as we look at some of the things that I like about fishing in terms of what I like about fishing is I get to catch and eat fish because, I like fish. I like seafood. When you're on your own time, when you have time, how much time do you spend on your own fishing, and how much is it like, all right, I'm going to go out and catch some fish that I want to eat?
Well, I mean, most of the time I'm out fishing, trying to better my techniques, learn, and that usually involves chasing bass. And 99% of the time when I catch bass, it's catch and release because I want those fish. I need them in the lake because they're worth money. There's no bass in the lake. I don't have a job and I can't catch any fish. I'm not going to get paid. So I need those fish in the lake. And there's instances like you'll keep small ones. I mean, selective harvest is good for the conservation of a body of water. But, I spend a lot of time, even when it's not during a tournament, just fun fishing because it's my passion. It's what I love to do. And I started fishing for a living and wanted to do it because I loved being out on the water so much. And I was just able to turn my career and my living into something that I love to do every day.
Circling back to, I referenced Jimmy Houston and Orlando Wilson earlier. These are shows in the South that I grew up. My dad watched them all the time, so I'd see them. What is, I guess, different from what they introduced to me than what you do on a daily basis? It's like, okay, they're out there, they're professional fishermen in terms, but they're also TV show hosts. I mean, where does the line blur between, okay, here's how to fish, and then, oh yeah, here's how to actually catch fish?
For us, we're on a timed limit, right? So we have 8 hours during a tournament day. We've got 2.5 days of practice. We've got a 4-day tournament schedule. So we fish full field Wednesday, Thursday, and then they make a cut halfway through, top 50. Top 50 gets paid, and they fish Saturday, and then top 12 fishes Sunday. So we are much more at mercy of Mother Nature. We can't control those conditions. Whereas a guy that's on a TV show, he can go film for 3 or 4 days, select the best day and put that out there on TV. Where, we're dealt with, we have to catch them that day in those conditions. So I'd say that's probably one of the biggest differences. We're under a lot more pressure than what a TV show would be.
When it comes to the personalities, I remember, I'm going to go back to my my experience at, I guess, what would be that Bassmaster Classic in 89 or 90. And there seemed to be certain anglers had big, they were, for lack of a better term, rock star anglers. Like I remember Woo Dave's got the biggest woo. It was like, what are they? Are they booing? No, his name is Woo. Okay. That's the one name in my life that stands out to me. That's one bass fisherman that I know his name. And it's because he had this huge crowd. I think he might have been from Virginia. Yep. And it was like, what is a rock star bass fisherman? Are you a rock star bass fisherman, or are there names in there that when you, oh my gosh, that's Brandon, and people just run to you?
I feel like I'm working on getting to that point. I've been doing it for 7 years now, and feel like I've had a good, successful career in the last 7 years. And there's definitely names that are the most well-known. Guys like Kevin Van Dam, Mike Iaconelli, Gerald Swindle. There are definitely rock stars in the sport that are more well-known than others. A lot of it comes from success. A lot of it comes from just their personality. Some of them have, great, big, eccentric personalities, and that puts them out there. And those guys come from all different walks of life.
Any bad boys out there, guys that like walk around and talk trash, be like, yeah, I'm going to catch, just basically kind of like the heel fisherman?
Maybe a little bit. I would say I can know is probably like our most considered like bad, quote unquote, bad boy of fishing. He grew up in Philadelphia and, used to be in like breakdance crews and was, in like a whole different world, and kind of was one of the first guys to break the mold of the Southern bass fisherman. And still to this day, he's probably the most, I wouldn't say loudmouth, but the most animated. I would say, like, he's the most animated guy we have, and I've actually heard him called before the bad boy of fishing.
Because I think there's bowlers like Walter Ray Williams, who does the crotch chop or something like that. It's like, yeah, they're wearing the shades, and I'm like, this is bowling. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it from a fishing standpoint. Now, circling this back into wrestling for a minute. One, do you have cauliflower ear?
I've minimal.
Okay, minimal. So because that usually leads to a discussion point.
Yeah, I've had it sewn. I've had it cut and sewn several times.
Okay, so that's usually a conversation starter. But in your travels, how many other people in the series have you come across that have wrestling backgrounds?
There's actually not a ton actually in the Elite Series. Not many. But when we go to venues like Mille Lacs, for instance, that are very heavy wrestling oriented regions of the country, I get a lot of guys that come up and talk to me about wrestling. Had a ton of people at Mille Lacs that came up and wanted to talk about wrestling, and which for me is cool because it's like an instant connection.
Yeah, and that's one thing I'm wondering as far as the Mille Lacs thing goes, because this goes back to the Chamber of Commerce. So was Onamia the host city for this, or was it Garrison? Was it Aiken? What was considered the host town for this event?
Well, it was the casino.
Okay.
So Mille Lacs Casino was where all of the events were held, and so I think they were like the biggest host. Which I don't even know exactly what town that's considered.
Well, it's on a reservation, Garrison. Technically.
It's on the reservation, so. That's where everything was held and hosted, and then kind of all the other towns are impacted by that.
I was going to say, because there's a burger shack, because my in-laws live on the north side, kind of on the I guess it's the northwest side of Mille Lacs, even though we fish one over, so we can actually catch the walleye.
Garrison.
Yep. Yeah, so we can actually keep the walleye we catch, if I ever actually catch one. But I will say, if there ever comes a time again, Onamia's got a little burger place called Happy's, and that is like the old school drive-in.
I stayed right next to it.
That was that's this place where we stop. We get my kids some ice cream. I get a nice burger or a corn dog and a malt. Oh, holy blood sugar, Batman! So glad to know that you checked out Happy's. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Now, as moving forward with your career, this was a big thing. Angler of the Year is well, I only ask a stupid question. Is this the biggest thing in bass fishing? Is Angler of the Year?
There's two major titles. There's the Bassmaster Classic, which is considered our Super Bowl of bass fishing, and then there's the Angler of the Year trophy. From a media and fan standpoint, I would say the Bassmaster Classic is probably the most well-known, or from like, getting your name out there worldwide. From an angler standpoint, amongst the angler community, and from like a personal standpoint, the Angler of the Year trophy is the most coveted, because the Classic, 1 week, 3 days, and you have the guy that wins. Angler of the Year is 10 weeks spread out over 9 months all across the country. And so it's the best of the best that year over several weeks. And so it's just and there's a lot less guys. There's been 46 Angler of the Year trophies handed out, and I was the 21st guy to win one. So there's not very many guys that hold that title.
It's an exclusive fraternity, it seems. Now, when I'm curious about the format of the tournaments, we were talking before we recorded it, the series, in this case, the Angler of the Year, Similar to maybe the NASCAR chase for the Cup, where, okay, you got series, and then it's not necessarily your last weekend or the last race that wins you the championship, but you have to have a good enough finish to end up getting enough points to win the overall season. What was the key going into that last weekend up on Lake Mille Lacs? This is, okay, I need this many pounds of fish. I have this many days. You first got to make the cut, I assume, and then you work from there. So what's the stress level like, and what's the attitude going into that final day?
For me, it's a little different than some of the other guys. I don't pay attention to the points throughout the entire year. I don't look at points. I've been doing that the last 4 years because I think it helps my decision process better. That way I'm making decisions on the water based on catching the most weight possible every single day and not trying to save points. It goes back to my wrestling days again, on where I felt like the best defense was a good offense. If I was taking a guy down, he couldn't take me down. And that's kind of how I approach fishing. And so going into the final tournament, I didn't know what the point spread was. I knew it was close just by people talking. And so I really went out and just tried to catch as much weight as possible every day. And for the people that don't know, we only get away 5 fish each day. So we have a culling process. If you catch 5, then you catch one that's bigger than your smallest. You throw your smallest out, put your biggest one in. We're only allowed to weigh 5 fish each day, the cumulative weight over the course of the tournament. And it was really a 2-man battle between me and another guy named Jason Christie. And it literally came down to the final day, the final weigh-in. I got on stage, and I wasn't super nervous just because I didn't know where I stood. I just knew that I was leading. I knew it was close. And at that point, our announcer says, all you need is 9 pounds to, accomplish this lifelong dream. I knew I had way more than 9 pounds. I weighed just under 20, and everything became real in that one moment.
Is it a little bit of showmanship where you put? I can't remember. Again, it's been 20-something years since I actually saw a fishing weigh-in, and I only saw it once, and it was. So do you put out your smallest fish and then go your big ones to get the big pop of the crowd to kind of put some finality, a little showmanship to it, or you just go, okay, here's my basket, go?
No, a little bit. So for that one, we did a drive-through weigh-in. Our boat comes through. We've got the fish in the live well. You pull a couple big ones out, get the crowd pumped up. I know, sounds crazy. People getting pumped up over fish. It happens. People are at home listening right now going, really?
I've seen it. I was young, but I've seen it. And they're yelling,
it's
woo.
Real. Yeah, it's real. I promise. People get pumped up over fish. Dudes wearing funny shirts holding fish up, and there's people cheering. It happens. And and then everything is just raw emotion. Like when that happens, it's no different than having a goal in anything else. When you achieve that goal, there's so much raw emotion that overtakes you. I'll be the first to admit, I was up there. I was so emotional, I couldn't even talk. Tears coming down my eyes, and just because it means so much.
When it comes to the big one, and I watched the interview after you were, got the Angler of the Year, and talking about the one, had one big one get away. There's always these fish stories, the big one, the one that got away. I want you to tell me about the biggest bass you've caught in competition. Where was it? How much did it weigh?
Oh, the biggest one I caught in competition. I caught a pretty big one, like over 9 pounds in one of our Elite Series events down in Falcon Lake in Texas. The biggest one this year, though, was an 8 pounds, 4 ounces that I caught on Sam Rayburn Reservoir in Texas that actually ended up helping me win that event that week. And it's on video. If anyone does want to see it, it's on my YouTube channel. You can go on there, it's BMP Fishing, scroll down to Sam Rayburn. I had that fish stuck in a tree for 2 minutes and 50 seconds. We put a time clock on it, and I just patience, sat there, waited it out, stuck in a tree. And I mean, essentially, the whole time I'm thinking, I have $100,000 on the end of my line and somehow have to figure out how to get this thing out of this tree that's down there in 20 feet. I can't reach it. And so just with a little bit of patience, a little bit of luck, I'm able to maneuver that fish out of the tree, land it, and then go on to win the event at the end of the week.
You know, one thing that's unique about bass too is they like to jump up out of the water, and that's a lot of the times that's where you lose the hook. And what's the key, I guess, from a fishing novice, somebody that's spent my entire life fishing, that actually has no idea what the heck he's doing most of the time, other than, okay, what do we fish? Leeches today? Okay. Okay, night crawlers? All right, cool. All right, we're going to spinnerbait on this one. That's basically the extent of my fishing knowledge. I throw over basically what my father-in-law or my dad throws over and hope I catch something. But I guess what's the key to hooking a giant fish? Where positioning is it swallowing the hook is usually not a good thing, obviously, for the fish, but to make sure that you've got that fish landed, I guess where's the perfect place to hook them?
The best place you can hook them is in the top of the mouth, somewhere toward the top. That's the hardest part of their mouth. It's the meatiest part of their mouth. So you've got less chance of ripping the hook out versus like if you hook them down toward the corners of the mouth and stuff, it more often it'll want to tear out if it's a big one. So roof of the mouth's the best. When you're fighting them, steady pressure. You just got to somewhat take your time, but don't give them slack line. When they jump, they create slack line. That's how you end up losing them.
Now, when one thing, Mille Lacs, circling back to there, that's a big walleye lake, and of course, there's all sorts of fishing regulations there. On you can't keep any walleye this year. I think last year you couldn't. I don't even think they had catch and release even available. And when you get to the localities, that can sometimes cause issues. In Minnesota, this isn't the first time you've had an issue in Minnesota. I was looking up in 2014. You're fishing the Mississippi on the Minnesota-Wisconsin line, and you'd mentioned culling earlier, which outside of Mille Lacs for tournaments is illegal in Minnesota. How do you learn those lessons in that situation, and how well do you guys have to be aware of the laws of the land for whether you can fish this side or not? I mean, I understand the Minnesota thing was a little unique.
Yeah, we have to. I mean, you have to be 100% aware of your surroundings, where you're at. Situation like that, the Mississippi River, where you've got bordering waters. Essentially, we could fish Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. The law dates back where Wisconsin used to be a no coaling state. Minnesota law, you can coal in the entire state, but on bordering waters, they just adopt the most restrictive law. Well, Wisconsin had changed their rules and allowed us to be able to coal in permitted tournaments. So that made the Mississippi law not being able to coal the most restrictive. So you could coal in Wisconsin, not on the other side of the river in Minnesota. I don't know why the DNR thinks that the fish don't just swim across the river, like they can't swim across the border. Whatever. That's their deal. But I had made just a mental mistake. I was leading the tournament, 6-pound lead. I had coaled one fish throughout my smallest one, where in what I thought was Wisconsin waters, ended up being Minnesota waters. Got that day's catch, disqualified. Ended up, not making the cut then, and in a tournament that I was really on pace to win, all of a sudden, one mistake, one mental lapse, and there goes $100,000. Classic spot, like a lot goes with that. I will say now, after that, there was a lot going on with the Minnesota DNR, and they have since removed that rule where you're allowed to coal across the entire Mississippi River.
Yeah, because as I've researched this stuff and just again living here and finding out, okay, because the
Yep.
DNR is a pretty serious industry up here. I mean, there is.
They
I mean,
are.
it's a big deal, and that kind of, I guess, the final point I want to talk about is kind of what the fisherman's role is, because there are people who believe any type of hunting, any type of fishing is wrong, and you probably know who the heck I'm talking about in that respect, but. And you talk, and then you hear hunters say it's about conservation, as you actually said, selective harvesting when you're talking about pulling fish out to eat. But what is the general consensus of you and your peers and your colleagues about fishing, catch and release, health of the fisheries, that type of thing? I mean, what's something that I think that the layman that doesn't know about fishing and fishermen need to understand about what you guys do and how much you guys care about the environment?
Yeah, I mean, 100% catch and release is important. And like you said, I mentioned selective harvest earlier. You see this a lot in farm ponds where, people have a ton of fish. They don't ever pull any out. And what happens is you end up with a bunch of just little tiny fish because the bigger fish, they can't compete. There's not enough food source to go around. So you do have to have a selective harvest. And that's where the DNRs come in, and they examine bodies of water. They survey them and come up with a plan for those bodies of water that's the most healthy for those fisheries. One, to allow, the sport of fishing so that there's enough fish in a body of water for the sporting aspect of it. But also, there's a huge economic impact from fishing on communities. Minnesota's a huge one. It's got so many lakes that a lot of that economic impact comes from fishing to several businesses and people, and that's how they make their living. And so you have to protect that resource, and then it goes to the other side of future generations to come. Like, if you don't take care of it, it's not going to be there for the future generations. And I think even people that don't follow the sport of fishing at all, a lot of those people still have memories of maybe going out with their dad or their grandfather or whatever it may be, of, even if it is just sitting on a dock, throwing a bobber out, those memories of fishing and those things like that, with a lot of people that just enjoy the outdoors, that goes away if there isn't some sort of conservation aspect there.
I kind of fibbed. I said I wanted to close with that. There's one question I've been itching to ask, and it comes from the tournament aspect. So Mille Lacs is a big lake. It's got a lot of different species of fish in it. What happens when you're hooking into a fish and you're like, oh, this isn't a bass, and it's going to take that much time to get that fish in a boat, released and go? I mean, how many other species are you regularly catching at these events that are taking up your time from catching actual bass?
That really just depends on the venue. Mille Lacs is a lake that's really healthy, got a ton of other species, and those do coexist at times. Walleye is a perfect example. Northern pike, muskie, those are ones that also a lot of times live, commingle with the bass that we're chasing. And in a tournament aspect, they're really just a pain. they're a pain in the ass, because it's taking away from time. We've only got 8 hours, so you're just wasting time. That's taking away from productive casts. If they're northern pike, muskie, whatever it may be, their teeth, even walleye, they're tearing up your baits, and so they're fun to catch. Love them outside of a tournament aspect. On a tournament day, don't touch my baits. If you're not a bass, don't touch it.
Yeah, and that includes the rock bass, which apparently when we have our little fishing contests and we go, all right, 2 points for every fish you get in a boat. Rock bass, negative 50 points.
Exactly.
Because there's nothing good about a rock bass. It just tastes like dirt, apparently, right?
I don't know. I've never eaten one.
No attempt to. But all right, Brandon, just give the folks out there, if they want to sit there and be like, yeah, you know what, I want to learn more about this fishing thing. I want to learn more about you, the wrestling guy, or actually the fishing guy who did wrestle. Where can they follow on social media, YouTube, and things of that nature to just follow what you're doing?
Well, you can follow Facebook and Instagram pages of mine are just at Brandon Palaniuk. And And then on my YouTube channel, it's BMP Fishing. I've got a ton of really cool videos on there. I actually hired a camera guy that followed me around all year, and we filmed every tournament from this season. So you can go on there, watch a bunch of cool slow-mo fish jumps. And if you don't know anything about it, that's where I would start, because it looks a lot cooler than just a whole 8 hours of fishing. So, and if you can get to all of that just by going to my website, which is bmpfishing.com.
Name sounds like a wrestler because he was a wrestler. Bassmaster Elite Angler of the Year, Brandon Palaniuk. Hey, thanks for the time today. I want to go fishing now. That's just that's what happens. I mean, I got my season. I still haven't caught a walleye, but I don't know. There's always hope, right?
Yeah. Next time we're in Minnesota, that means we got to hook up.
All right, we'll do fishing. That. I'm gonna be like, okay, all right. Talk to my father-in-law. All right, Harv, I got a ringer. He's gonna help me catch a bigger fish than you.
That's right.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.